Baby discovered a bear cub trapped in a dance studio mirror room. What Baby did next moved hearts. The old dance studio stood at the corner of Maple Street, its weathered brick walls holding decades of memories within them. Jessica Brooks pushed open the heavy wooden door, the familiar creak echoing through the empty hallway as she stepped inside with her 18-month-old daughter, Emma, nestled in her arms. The afternoon sun filtered through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors that had witnessed countless rehearsals, performances, and dreams taking flight. Jessica had inherited this place from her grandmother just 3 weeks ago, and today was her first real visit to assess what needed to be done before she could reopen it to the community. Emma squirmed in her arms, her tiny hands reaching out toward the light streaming through the windows. Her babbling filling the quiet space with innocent joy that seemed to breathe new life into the abandoned studio. The main rehearsal room was exactly as Jessica remembered it from her childhood visits, with bars lining the walls and the massive mirror that covered the entire eastern wall, reflecting the room back on itself in an endless dance of light and shadow. She set Emma down on the floor, watching as her daughter immediately began exploring, her unsteady toddler steps carrying her toward the mirror with the kind of fearless curiosity that only children possess. The mirror itself was a marvel of craftsmanship, installed nearly 60 years ago when the studio first opened, its surface still remarkably clear despite the years of neglect. Jessica walked slowly around the room, running her fingers along the dusty bars, remembering the summers she'd spent here learning ballet from her grandmother, the stern but loving woman who had dedicated her life to teaching dance to generations of children in this small town. As she moved through the space, Jessica noticed something peculiar about the mirror room that she'd never observed as a child. There was a section near the far corner where the reflection seemed slightly different, as if the glass had been installed at a different time, or perhaps damaged and repaired. Emma had wandered over to that exact spot, her tiny palms pressed against the cool surface, giggling at her own reflection. Jessica smiled at her daughter's innocent play, but then Emma did something unexpected. She began patting the mirror in a specific pattern, almost rhythmically, as if she were trying to communicate with something on the other side. At first, Jessica thought nothing of it, assuming it was just typical toddler behavior. But then she heard it, a faint sound coming from behind the mirror, like a soft scratching or shuffling that definitely wasn't an echo. Moving closer to investigate, Jessica knelt beside Emma, placing her ear against the mirror's surface. The sound was clearer now, definitely coming from behind the glass, and it had a quality to it that made her heart skip a beat. It wasn't mechanical or random, it had a pattern, almost like something was responding to Emma's tapping. Her daughter seemed completely unfazed, continuing her gentle percussion against the glass with increasing excitement, her blue eyes wide with wonder. Jessica's mind raced through logical explanations. Perhaps there were pipes behind the wall, or maybe the old building's foundation was settling, creating unusual acoustics. But deep down, something told her this was different, that whatever was behind that mirror had been waiting there for a very long time. She stood up and examined the edges of the mirror more carefully, noticing for the first time that this section wasn't actually attached to the wall in the same way as the rest. There were small gaps along the frame, and when she pressed against it experimentally, the entire panel shifted slightly. Her heart began racing as she realized this wasn't just a mirror. It was a door, a hidden entrance to something that had been concealed for who knows how long. Emma continued her tapping, and the responding sounds grew more insistent, more desperate even, as if whatever was back there had suddenly realized that someone was finally listening. Jessica's hands trembled as she felt along the frame, searching for a latch or mechanism that would allow her to open it properly. The discovery of a small, concealed lever near the floor made her catch her breath. It was painted to match the wall, nearly invisible unless you knew exactly where to look. She hesitated for a moment, wondering if she should call someone. Perhaps Michael Hayes, the contractor who had been helping her assess the building's condition. But Emma's continued interaction with whatever was behind the mirror compelled her to act. She pressed the lever, and with a soft click, the mirror panel swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a narrow passage that extended into darkness. The air that rushed out was cool and musty, carrying with it the scent of age and secrets long buried. Emma immediately tried to toddle toward the opening, but Jessica scooped her up, holding her daughter close while peering into the mysterious space. As her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she could make out what appeared to be a small room, perhaps 10 feet by 10 feet, with walls lined with what looked like old photographs and documents. But what truly caught her attention and made her gasp was the small figure huddled in the corner, a shape that moved slightly as the light from the studio illuminated it for the first time in what must have been years. It wasn't human. That much was immediately clear. But as it lifted its head and looked at them with eyes that held an almost human intelligence, Jessica realized they had discovered something extraordinary. The creature was a bear cub, but unlike any bear cub Jessica had ever seen in pictures or at the zoo. Its fur was a deep golden brown that seemed to shimmer in the light, and its eyes held a quality of awareness that was both beautiful and heartbreaking. It couldn't have been more than a few months old, though how it had survived in this hidden room was a complete mystery. The cub made a soft whimpering sound, not threatening but plaintive, as if it had been calling for help for so long that it had almost given up hope of ever being heard. Emma reached out her chubby arms toward the cub, making happy gurgling sounds, showing no fear whatsoever of the unusual creature before them. Jessica's mind struggled to process what she was seeing. How had a bear cub ended up trapped in a hidden room behind a mirror in an old dance studio? The walls of the small space were covered with photographs, and as she stepped carefully inside, still holding Emma, she began to understand that this wasn't just any hidden room. The photographs showed her grandmother at various ages, always with animals, many of them bears. There were newspaper clippings, too, headlines about a wildlife sanctuary that had operated on the outskirts of town decades ago, run by none other than her grandmother before she had opened the dance studio. The pieces of a puzzle Jessica never knew existed began falling into place. Setting Emma down carefully but keeping a firm grip on her hand, Jessica moved closer to the cub. It didn't retreat or show aggression. Instead, it seemed to recognize something in them, perhaps the kindness in their approach, or maybe something more. Around its neck was a collar, old and worn but still intact, with a small metal tag. Jessica reached out slowly, her movements deliberate and calm, and the cub allowed her to read the inscription. The name engraved there made her heart stop. Hope, if found, please care for her. She is special. The date on the tag was from just 3 weeks ago, the same day her grandmother had passed away. The realization hit Jessica like a wave. Her grandmother had been caring for this cub, keeping it safe in this hidden sanctuary within the studio. But why the secrecy? As she looked through more of the documents plastered on the walls, she found veterinary records, official-looking papers with government seals, and what appeared to be correspondence with wildlife authorities. The story that emerged was both heartwarming and complex. This cub was apparently the last of a very rare subspecies, one that had been thought extinct until her grandmother had found it, orphaned and alone, several months ago. The authorities had wanted to take it to a research facility. But her grandmother, ever the protector of the innocent and vulnerable, had hidden it here instead, caring for it in secret while trying to find a better solution. Emma had wandered over to the cub while Jessica was reading, and to her amazement, the two young creatures were now sitting face to face, Emma babbling in her baby language while the cub made soft, responsive sounds. There was an immediate connection between them that transcended species, a pure and simple recognition of kindred spirits. The cub, despite its ordeal, seemed gentle and almost domesticated, clearly having been handled with love and care. Jessica found containers of food and water in the corner, along with toys and blankets, evidence of her grandmother's dedication to keeping this secret charge comfortable and safe. The weight of the discovery and the responsibility it represented began to settle on Jessica's shoulders. She couldn't just call animal control. The documents made it clear that there were people who would want to take this cub for purposes that might not be in its best interest. Yet she couldn't keep it hidden here forever either. As she pondered what to do, she noticed a letter tucked behind one of the photographs, addressed to her in her grandmother's familiar handwriting. With trembling fingers, she opened it and began to read the message that would change everything she thought she knew about her grandmother and the legacy she had inherited. The letter explained everything in her grandmother's gentle but determined voice. The cub, Hope, was indeed special, not just because of her rare genetics, but because she represented something more. Her grandmother had been part of a network of conservationists who worked to protect endangered animals from exploitation. The dance studio had been a perfect cover for this secret work, and the hidden room had sheltered many creatures over the years before they could be safely relocated to appropriate sanctuaries. Hope was to be the last, but her grandmother's sudden illness had prevented her from completing the arrangements. She was trusting Jessica to finish what she had started, to find a safe haven for Hope where she could live freely but protected. Emma and Hope had now progressed to playing a gentle game of pat-a-cake, or at least Emma's version of it, with the cub mimicking her movements with surprising accuracy. Watching them, Jessica felt a surge of determination. She would honor her grandmother's wish, but first she needed help. She pulled out her phone and called Michael Hayes, the contractor, but not to report the discovery. Instead, she asked him to come to the studio immediately, telling him only that she needed his help with something important and confidential. Michael had known her grandmother well, and had always spoken of her with deep respect. If anyone would understand and help, it would be him. While waiting for Michael, Jessica explored the hidden room more thoroughly. She found detailed care instructions for Hope, including dietary needs, medical history, and even behavioral notes that revealed the cub's remarkable intelligence. Her grandmother had been teaching Hope basic commands and had documented an extraordinary ability to understand and respond to human communication. There were videos on an old tablet showing Hope performing simple tasks, playing games that required problem-solving skills, and displaying emotional responses that seemed almost human in their complexity. It became clear that Hope was not just special because of her rarity, but because she represented something unprecedented in human-animal interaction. Michael arrived within 20 minutes, and his reaction to the discovery was everything Jessica had hoped for. His initial shock quickly gave way to understanding and then determination. He had suspected her grandmother was involved in something beyond just teaching dance, having occasionally seen unusual visitors and deliveries at odd hours. Together, they reviewed the documents and began formulating a plan. Michael knew of a private wildlife preserve run by an old friend, Connor Adams, someone who shared her grandmother's philosophy about conservation and protection. It was located in a remote area of the mountains, far from prying eyes and potential threats. The challenge was transporting Hope safely and secretly. She had clearly been habituated to human contact, which was both a blessing and a concern. While it made her easier to handle, it also meant she couldn't simply be released into the wild. She would need a special kind of sanctuary, one where she could live naturally, but with human support when needed. As they discussed options, Emma and Hope had curled up together on a blanket, the toddler's arm draped protectively over the cub's furry body. The sight was so touching that Jessica had to fight back tears, understanding now why her grandmother had risked so much to protect creatures like Hope. Over the next several hours, they made preparations for Hope's journey to safety. Michael contacted Connor, who immediately agreed to help, no questions asked beyond what was necessary for Hope's care. Jessica found herself diving deep into her grandmother's hidden life, discovering a woman she had never fully known. The dance studio had been more than just a place to teach children grace and movement. It had been a sanctuary in the truest sense, a place where the vulnerable found protection, and where secrets were kept not for personal gain but for the preservation of innocence and beauty in a world that often seemed intent on destroying both. As evening approached, they prepared a special carrier for Hope, one that Michael had modified from equipment in his truck. The cub seemed to understand that something important was happening and showed remarkable cooperation. Emma had to be gently separated from her new friend, which resulted in tears from both the toddler and, surprisingly, what appeared to be genuine distress from Hope. Jessica promised Emma they would visit Hope in her new home, a promise she intended to keep. The bond between the two youngsters was too special to sever completely. The journey to the preserve took place under cover of darkness, with Jessica, Emma, Michael, and Hope traveling in Michael's van. Hope remained calm throughout the trip, occasionally making soft sounds that Emma would answer with her own baby babble. It was as if they were having a conversation that transcended language, a pure exchange of emotion and connection. Jessica found herself thinking about the nature of communication, about how much we humans might be missing in our interactions with the natural world. Her grandmother had obviously understood something that most people overlooked, that animals were capable of far more than we typically gave them credit for. Connor Adams met them at the entrance to the preserve, and his gentle manner immediately put everyone, including Hope, at ease. He had prepared a special enclosure that would allow Hope to acclimate gradually to her new environment, while still maintaining the human contact she had grown accustomed to. The preserve itself was a marvel. Hundreds of acres of protected land where rescued and endangered animals could live in peace. Connor explained that Hope would not be alone. There were other bears here, though none of her exact subspecies. In time, she might form bonds with them, creating a new kind of family. The moment of separation was harder than Jessica had anticipated. Hope seemed to understand that this was goodbye, at least for now, and she approached each of them in turn. She nuzzled Michael's hand, allowed Connor to check her collar one last time, and then came to Jessica and Emma. The cub placed her paw gently on Emma's tiny hand, holding it there for a long moment while looking directly into the toddler's eyes. Emma, for her part, seemed to understand the gravity of the moment, remaining unusually quiet and still. Then Hope turned to Jessica, and in her eyes Jessica saw something that would stay with her forever. Gratitude mixed with an intelligence that suggested Hope understood far more than any of them realized. As they drove away from the preserve, Emma fell asleep in her car seat, exhausted from the day's adventures. Jessica found herself crying, not from sadness but from a complex mix of emotions. She had discovered a hidden part of her grandmother's life, had helped complete her final mission, and had witnessed something extraordinary in the connection between her daughter and Hope. Michael drove in respectful silence, occasionally glancing at her with understanding. He had been moved by the experience too, she could tell, and she suspected this wouldn't be the last time he would help with such endeavors. Back at the studio, they sealed the hidden room temporarily, but Jessica knew she would return to it. There were more documents to go through, more stories to uncover about her grandmother's secret life as a protector of the vulnerable. She wondered how many other creatures had passed through that hidden sanctuary, how many lives her grandmother had saved without anyone knowing. The dance studio would reopen. She had decided that for certain now, but it would carry on more than just the tradition of teaching dance. It would continue to be a place of sanctuary, though perhaps in different ways than before. In the days that followed, Jessica found herself changed by the experience. She looked at the world differently, noticing things she had previously overlooked. The way birds communicated with each other, the intelligence in a street cat's eyes, the complex social structures of the squirrels in the park. Emma, too, seemed different, more aware and connected to the animals around her. They visited Hope at the preserve every week, and each time the reunion between Emma and the cub was joyful and touching. Hope was thriving in her new environment, growing stronger and more confident. But she never forgot her first human friends. Connor reported that Hope was displaying remarkable adaptability and intelligence, even teaching some of her behaviors to the other bears in neighboring enclosures. She had become something of a bridge between the human caretakers and the other animals, often helping to calm new arrivals or alerting staff to problems with other residents. It was as if her time in the hidden room, rather than damaging her, had given her unique abilities that made her invaluable to the preserve's mission. Jessica couldn't help but think her grandmother would have been proud to see how things had turned out. The story of Hope's rescue remained a secret among the small group who had been involved, but its impact rippled outward in subtle ways. Michael began volunteering at the preserve, using his construction skills to build better enclosures and shelters. Jessica incorporated animal welfare education into her dance studio's curriculum, teaching children not just how to move gracefully, but how to move through the world with awareness and compassion for all living things. And Emma, as she grew older, maintained her special connection with Hope, a bond that would shape her into someone who understood that the boundaries between human and animal were far more fluid than most people believed. 3 months after Hope's rescue, Jessica received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of Hope playing in a stream at the preserve, looking healthy and happy. On the back, in handwriting she didn't recognize, were the words, "Your grandmother's network lives on. Thank you for keeping the faith." She never discovered who sent it, but she kept the photo framed in the studio. A reminder that some secrets are worth keeping and that sometimes the most important work happens in the shadows, away from the spotlight. The dance studio thrived under Jessica's management, becoming not just a place to learn dance, but a community center where children learned about empathy, conservation, and the interconnectedness of all life. The hidden room was eventually converted into a small museum dedicated to her grandmother's conservation work, though the full story of Hope was never publicly revealed. Visitors would often comment on the special energy of the place, how it felt like more than just a dance studio. Jessica would smile and agree, knowing that the spirit of sanctuary her grandmother had created lived on in every lesson taught and every child who passed through its doors. Emma and Hope's friendship continued to flourish over the years. As Emma grew into a young woman with a passion for wildlife biology, Hope matured into a magnificent bear who had become the preserve's most famous resident, though her true story remained known only to a few. Their bond had proven that connection and communication between species wasn't just possible but essential for the future of conservation. Emma would often tell people that a bear had taught her more about being human than most humans ever had, and while they might laugh, thinking it was a joke, those who knew the truth understood the profound wisdom in her words. The legacy of that day in the dance studio, when a baby's innocent tapping on a mirror had revealed a hidden world of compassion and protection, continued to influence lives in ways both seen and unseen. Jessica often thought about the moment when she had stood at the threshold of that hidden room, faced with a choice between the easy path of calling authorities and the harder path of honoring her grandmother's trust. She had chosen love over law, compassion over compliance, and in doing so, had discovered that sometimes the most important dance we do is the one that nobody sees, the quiet movements of kindness that happen when we think no one is watching. As the years passed, the network her grandmother had been part of gradually revealed itself to Jessica. She received occasional cryptic messages, requests for temporary sanctuary, or information about animals in need. She learned to navigate this shadow world of conservation, understanding that sometimes the law and what was right didn't align perfectly. The studio's hidden room was renovated and occasionally still served its original purpose, though now with better ventilation and modern amenities. Emma would help when she was home from college, her expertise growing with each passing year, her bond with Hope serving as the foundation for a career dedicated to understanding and protecting wildlife. The story could have ended there, a tale of rescue and redemption. But life had more surprises in store. On Emma's 21st birthday, Connor called with news that would bring the story full circle. Hope had given birth to cubs, twins, a miracle considering her subspecies was thought to be extinct. The father was unknown, possibly a wild bear who had wandered into the preserve's territory, but genetic testing confirmed that the cubs carried the rare genes that made Hope special. The preservation of her line, which had seemed impossible, had occurred naturally, without the intervention of the scientists who had wanted to study her in a laboratory. Jessica and Emma arrived at the preserve to find Hope proudly nursing her cubs, looking every bit the contented mother. When she saw them approaching, Hope made a soft sound that they had come to recognize as her greeting, and carefully picked up one of the cubs, carrying it to the fence where Emma stood. It was a gesture of trust so profound that Connor, who had seen countless animal behaviors, was moved to tears. Hope was sharing her most precious possessions with the humans who had saved her, acknowledging the bond that had begun years ago when a toddler's hands had tapped on a mirror and refused to give up until someone answered. The cubs were named Faith and Grace, continuing the tradition her grandmother had started. They would grow up in the preserve, protected but wild, carrying forward the genetic legacy of their subspecies while also inheriting their mother's unique understanding of the human-animal connection. Emma spent that summer at the preserve, studying the cubs and documenting their development, her research contributing to a new understanding of bear intelligence and social bonding. The scientific community was astounded by her findings, though the full story of how she had come to have such unprecedented access to these rare bears remained her secret. As Jessica watched her daughter work with Hope and the cubs, she saw her grandmother's spirit alive in both of them. The dance studio had taught thousands of children to move with grace, but its greatest achievement had been teaching one small girl that the most beautiful dance was the one between all living things. A choreography of compassion that connected every creature on earth. The mirror that had hidden Hope had reflected more than just images. It had reflected the best of humanity, the willingness to protect the vulnerable, to keep difficult secrets, and to choose love over fear. The preserve expanded over the years, with anonymous donations flowing in from her grandmother's network, now shepherded by Jessica and eventually Emma. More animals found sanctuary. More species were pulled back from the brink of extinction, and more children learned that dance was more than just movement. It was a way of being in harmony with the world. Hope lived to the remarkable age of 35, seeing her cubs grow and have cubs of their own, her line secured and thriving. When she finally passed, peaceful and surrounded by her extended family, both human and bear. The preserve held a ceremony that brought together all those whose lives she had touched. Emma, now a renowned wildlife biologist, spoke at the ceremony about the day a baby discovered a bear cub trapped in a dance studio mirror room, and how that discovery had changed not just their lives, but the future of conservation itself. She talked about the courage of a grandmother who had chosen to act when others would have looked away, about a mother who had chosen to honor a difficult legacy, and about a bear who had taught them all that the barriers between species were constructs of our own making. The audience, filled with conservationists, scientists, and local community members who had come to love hope, understood that they were part of something larger than themselves. The dance studio still stands on Maple Street, run now by Emma's younger sister, who had learned the family secret and embraced it with the same dedication. The mirror room has been preserved as a monument to hidden kindness, and sometimes, late in the evening, if you listen carefully, you can almost hear the echo of tiny hands tapping on glass, calling out to whatever might be listening on the other side. Children still come to learn dance, but they also learn about hope, about the importance of protecting those who cannot protect themselves, and about the magic that happens when we choose compassion over convenience. The impact of that single moment when Emma's baby hands had found hope continues to ripple outward, touching lives in ways that would have seemed impossible. Conservation programs around the world have adopted principles developed from the study of Hope and her cubs, understanding that the preservation of species requires not just scientific knowledge but emotional intelligence and genuine connection. The story, shared quietly among those who need to hear it, has inspired countless acts of kindness and protection, creating a network of guardians who understand that sometimes the most important work happens in secret, behind mirrors and closed doors, in the spaces between what is legal and what is right. Jessica, now in her 70s, still visits the preserve regularly, though Hope has been gone for many years. She sits by the stream where Hope used to play, watching Hope's great-grand cubs splash in the water, their golden fur shimmering in the sunlight just like their ancestors. Emma, who has established multiple preserves around the world, always returns home for these visits, and together they remember the day that changed everything. They talk about Jessica's grandmother, about the courage it took to hide Hope, and about the magic of a connection between a human baby and a bear cub that transcended every barrier humans had constructed between themselves and the natural world. The story of Hope has become legend in conservation circles, though the full truth is known only to a select few. Scientific papers have been written about the remarkable intelligence and adaptability of her line, but they can't capture the real magic of what happened in that hidden room. They can't explain how a dying woman's last act of compassion had saved not just one bear, but an entire subspecies. They can't quantify the impact of a toddler's innocent love on a frightened cub's ability to trust, and they certainly can't measure the ripple effects of one family's decision to choose love over law, creating a legacy that would protect vulnerable creatures for generations to come. As the sun sets over the preserve, casting long shadows through the trees, the descendants of Hope gather at the feeding area, their movements graceful and confident. They are wild bears in every sense, but they carry within them something special, a genetic memory perhaps, or maybe something more mystical, that makes them unafraid of the humans who protect them. They seem to understand that they are part of a larger story, one that began with a secret room behind a mirror, and continues with every choice to protect rather than exploit, to preserve rather than profit. The dance studio's current students know the story of Hope, though they might not know all the details. They know that their studio is special, that it has a history of protecting beautiful things, and that dance is about more than just performance. They learn to move through the world with awareness and grace, understanding that every action creates ripples, that every choice matters, and that sometimes the most important audience is the one you can't see. They practice in front of the same mirrors that once hid hope, and sometimes, if they're very quiet and very still, they can feel the presence of something magical, a reminder that miracles can hide in the most unexpected places. The network that Jessica's grandmother belonged to has evolved with the times, using modern technology to coordinate rescues and share information while maintaining the secrecy necessary to protect vulnerable animals from those who would exploit them. Emma has become one of its leaders, using her scientific credentials to provide legitimate cover for activities that sometimes skirt the edges of legality. She has learned to navigate the complex world of conservation politics while never forgetting the simple truth she learned as a baby, that love and connection transcend species, and that sometimes the smallest hands can open the biggest doors. Looking back, Jessica often marvels at the chain of events that began with her inheriting an old dance studio. She thinks about the moment she almost didn't investigate the sound behind the mirror, the moment she almost called the authorities instead of Michael, the countless moments when things could have gone differently. But something, perhaps her grandmother's spirit or perhaps just the invisible threads that connect all living things, had guided them to make the right choices. Hope had been saved, but in saving her, they had all been transformed, becoming part of something ancient and essential. The eternal dance between humans and nature. The story of the baby who discovered a bear cub trapped in a dance studio mirror room has become more than just a family tale. It has become a reminder that extraordinary things can happen when we pay attention to the small voices, whether they're the tapping of baby hands on glass or the soft cries of creatures in need. It reminds us that our ancestors often knew things we've forgotten, that wisdom can be hidden in unexpected places, and that sometimes the most important legacies are the ones that were never meant to be public. As night falls over the preserve, the descendants of hope settle into sleep, safe and protected in their sanctuary. Miles away, in the dance studio, the last class of the day is ending, and children are gathering their things, chattering excitedly about their recital next week. But one small girl lingers by the mirror, her hand pressed against the glass, her eyes bright with curiosity. Her teacher watches, remembering another child who once stood in that same spot, and wonders what magic this one might discover. The cycle continues, the dance goes on, and somewhere in the connection between all living things, hope's spirit lives on, a testament to the power of compassion and the miracles that can happen when we choose to listen to the quiet voices that call to us from hidden places. Part 2. The legacy continues. 5 years had passed since Hope's cubs, Faith and Grace, had been born at the preserve, and the impact of their existence continued to ripple through the conservation world in ways no one could have predicted. Emma, now 31, and a respected voice in wildlife biology, had established her own research facility adjacent to Connors Preserve, where she studied the unique behavioral patterns that Hope's line exhibited. Her work had attracted international attention, though she carefully guarded the full story of how she had come to have such an extraordinary relationship with these rare bears. The morning sun cast golden rays through her office window as she reviewed the latest observations, noting how Faith's cubs were displaying the same remarkable intelligence that had made their grandmother so special. Jessica arrived at the research facility with her younger daughter, Sarah, who had taken over the dance studio's daily operations but remained deeply connected to the family's conservation work. They had received an urgent call from Connor about something discovered in the preserve's northern territory, something that required their immediate attention and discretion. As they walked through the facility, past the observation rooms and laboratories, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that they were about to uncover another piece of the puzzle that her great-grandmother had left behind. The documents they had found in the dance studio's hidden room had hinted at other locations, other secrets, but until now, they had found no concrete evidence of what else might be hidden in their small town's seemingly ordinary landscape. Connor met them at the entrance to the preserve, his usually calm demeanor replaced with barely contained excitement mixed with concern. He led them through winding trails, past the enclosures where Hope's descendants played in the morning light, to a section of the preserve that bordered an old, abandoned property that had recently been acquired through an anonymous donation. The property included a dilapidated barn that had stood empty for decades, its weathered boards and sagging roof suggesting it held nothing of value. But Connor's team, while surveying the land for potential expansion, had discovered something extraordinary hidden beneath the barn's rotting floorboards. The underground space they descended into was far more sophisticated than anything they had expected to find in an old barn. It was a fully equipped medical facility, complete with surgical equipment, incubators, and climate-controlled storage units that, remarkably, were still functioning, powered by a geothermal system that must have cost a fortune to install. The walls were lined with filing cabinets, and a quick examination revealed records dating back 50 years, all in Jessica's grandmother's distinctive handwriting. This wasn't just another hidden sanctuary. This was the heart of an operation far more extensive than they had imagined, a secret veterinary hospital where injured and endangered animals had been treated and rehabilitated before being relocated to safety. Sarah found a logbook that detailed hundreds of cases, each one meticulously documented with photographs, medical notes, and follow-up reports. There were bears, of course, but also wolves, lynx, eagles, and dozens of other species, many of them officially listed as extinct in the region. Jessica's grandmother hadn't just been hiding Hope. She had been running an underground railroad for wildlife, saving creatures from poachers, habitat destruction, and government programs that prioritize development over conservation. The scope of the operation was staggering, and it was clear that she couldn't have done it alone. There were references to other helpers, code names, and locations that suggested a network spanning the entire state and possibly beyond. Among the records, Emma discovered something that made her heart race with scientific excitement and emotional wonder. There were detailed notes about Hope's mother, including photographs and genetic analyses that her great-grandmother had somehow managed to conduct decades before such technology was widely available. Hope hadn't been a random rescue. She had been part of a deliberate breeding program designed to preserve the rare subspecies. Her great-grandmother had been working with a small group of conservationists to maintain genetic diversity in isolated populations, using this secret facility to provide medical care and safe spaces for breeding pairs. Hope's placement in the dance studio had been an emergency measure when the facility had been nearly discovered by federal agents investigating wildlife trafficking in the area. The implications of this discovery were overwhelming. If the records were accurate, there could be descendants of the animals treated here living throughout the region, populations of supposedly extinct species surviving in hidden pockets of wilderness. Emma immediately began cross-referencing the locations mentioned in the records with current wildlife surveys, finding discrepancies that suggested her hypothesis might be correct. Areas marked as devoid of certain species showed unexplained signs of their presence. Tracks and scat that had been dismissed as misidentification might actually be evidence of her great-grandmother's success in establishing secret breeding populations. As they continued exploring the facility, they found a section that had been sealed off with a heavy door marked with warning symbols. Inside was a quarantine area, and what appeared to be a research laboratory more advanced than anything that should have existed in a barn in rural America 50 years ago. There were tissue samples preserved in liquid nitrogen, blood samples from hundreds of animals, and detailed genetic maps hand-drawn with an accuracy that rivaled modern computer analyses. Jessica's grandmother had been more than a dance teacher and a wildlife rescuer. She had been a scientist operating decades ahead of her time, using methods and reaching conclusions that mainstream science was only now beginning to understand. A leather journal found in a locked drawer revealed the personal side of this massive undertaking. Jessica's grandmother wrote about the moral dilemmas she faced, the constant fear of discovery, and the weight of knowing that she held the survival of entire species in her hands. She wrote about teaching Jessica ballet as a cover for meetings with other network members, about using recital trips to transport animals to new locations, and about the heartbreak of losing animals she couldn't save. One entry, dated just days before Hope was hidden in the dance studio, described her failing health and her desperate hope that someone would continue the work after she was gone. The journal also contained a revelation that changed everything they thought they knew about Hope's rescue. Jessica's grandmother had known she was dying months before she actually passed away. She had deliberately placed Hope in the hidden room, knowing that Jessica would inherit the studio and, she hoped, discover the cub. It hadn't been an emergency measure, but a carefully planned passing of the torch. She had chosen Hope specifically because of her unique genetics and remarkable intelligence, believing that this one bear could serve as a bridge between the old way of conservation, shrouded in secrecy, and a new approach that might be more open while still protecting the vulnerable. Michael arrived at the facility, having been called by Jessica when the scope of the discovery became clear. His construction expertise was needed to assess the structural integrity of the underground facility and to determine what could be salvaged and modernized. As he examined the infrastructure, he discovered that the entire system had been designed with multiple fail-safes and escape routes, including a tunnel that led to a natural cave system extending for miles underground. This wasn't just a medical facility. It was a fortress designed to protect its occupants from any threat, human or natural. The engineering was so advanced that Michael suspected government involvement, though whether as supporters or as unwitting donors of lost equipment was impossible to determine. The cave system itself held more surprises. Deep within, they found evidence of long-term habitation by various animals, suggesting that this had been used as a recovery space for creatures too injured or traumatized to be immediately released. The caves maintained a constant temperature year-round and had natural springs providing fresh water. Emma found scratch marks on the walls that matched Hope's claw patterns, evidence that the beloved bear had spent time here before, being moved to the dance studio. The emotional weight of standing where Hope had once recovered from whatever trauma had orphaned her was almost overwhelming. Sarah, meanwhile, had been systematically photographing and digitizing all the records, creating a database that would allow them to track the descendants of animals treated at the facility. Her work revealed patterns that suggested several current wildlife populations owed their existence to her great-grandmother's intervention. A pack of wolves in the northern mountains, thought to be migrants from Canada, showed genetic markers indicating they were actually descendants of a pair rescued from a zoo closure in the 1970s. A population of rare owls that had mysteriously appeared in the local forest 20 years ago matched the description of birds treated for pesticide poisoning at the facility. The discovery raised serious ethical and legal questions. Much of what Jessica's grandmother had done had been illegal, even if morally justified. The current legal status of the facility was murky at best, and revealing its existence could potentially lead to government seizure and the loss of valuable conservation resources. After much discussion, they decided to maintain the secrecy while gradually modernizing the facility to serve as a backup location for the preserve's most vulnerable residents. Connor would officially list it as a storage facility, while Emma would quietly use it for sensitive research projects that required extra security. As days turned into weeks, they continued uncovering the full extent of the network Jessica's grandmother had built. Contact information, some of it still valid, led them to other elderly conservationists who had been waiting for someone to revive the network. These aging activists had maintained their own small sanctuaries and safe houses, keeping the faith that someday someone would continue the work. Emma found herself at the center of a reactivating network, using modern technology to coordinate what had once been done through coded letters and secret meetings. The old guard passed on their knowledge, their contacts, and their properties, trusting the new generation to adapt their methods to modern challenges. The impact on Hope's descendants was immediate and profound. With access to the medical facility, Emma could provide better care for injured or sick bears without risking exposure to public veterinary clinics. Faith had recently been injured in a territorial dispute, and the facility's surgical suite allowed for treatment that would have been impossible at the preserve. As Faith recovered in the same space where her grandmother had once been treated, the continuity of care across generations seemed to validate everything Jessica's grandmother had built. The research potential of the preserved samples was staggering. DNA from species thought extinct for decades could potentially be used for de-extinction projects, though the ethical implications required careful consideration. Emma found herself in correspondence with leading geneticists who were astounded by the quality and variety of the samples. Several offered substantial funding for access, but Emma and her family decided to maintain control, using the resources only for projects that aligned with their conservation philosophy. The samples from Hope's mother were particularly valuable, providing genetic information that could help ensure the long-term survival of the subspecies. Local support for their work grew as carefully selected community members were brought into the secret. The town had always wondered about Jessica's grandmother's mysterious visitors and strange activities, and learning the truth created a sense of pride and purpose. A network of volunteers formed, people who could be trusted to help transport animals, maintain safe houses, or simply look the other way when unusual things happened at odd hours. The dance studio students became unwitting ambassadors, their performances raising funds for general wildlife conservation that actually supported very specific and secret projects. One of the most remarkable discoveries came when they found a series of maps hidden in a false bottom of a filing cabinet. These maps showed locations throughout the state where animals had been released, creating wildlife corridors that existed completely outside official conservation planning. Jessica's grandmother had been playing a long game, establishing populations in areas that would eventually connect as development patterns changed. Her predictions about urban growth and wilderness preservation had been remarkably accurate, and many of the animals she had saved now lived in protected areas that hadn't existed when she released them. The maps also revealed something unexpected about Hope's cubs. According to the records, Faith and Grace were not Hope's first offspring. Years earlier, before coming to the dance studio, Hope had given birth to a single cub during her recovery in the cave system. That cub had been secretly relocated to a preserve in Canada, where it had successfully integrated with a wild population. Emma immediately began the process of tracking down this unknown sibling, hoping to reunite the family line and strengthen the genetic diversity of the subspecies. The search would take months, but eventually they would find him. A magnificent male bear living free in the Canadian Rockies, carrying on his mother's legacy in the wild. As autumn approached, they decided to hold a secret gathering of all the network members, old and new, at the preserve. It would be disguised as a wildlife photography workshop, but in reality, it would be a passing of the torch ceremony. The elderly conservationists who had worked with Jessica's grandmother would formally hand over their responsibilities to the younger generation, sharing stories and strategies accumulated over decades of secret conservation work. Emma prepared presentations on modern techniques that could enhance their traditional methods, while maintaining the security and discretion that had kept the network functioning for so long. The gathering exceeded all expectations. Nearly 100 people attended, ranging from teenagers who had grown up hearing whispered stories of the network to octogenarians who had been among its founding members. They shared tales of midnight rescues, narrow escapes from federal agents, and the joy of seeing species thought lost forever, thriving in secret sanctuaries. Connor revealed that his preserve had always been part of the network, established with funding quietly provided by Jessica's grandmother and her associates. The preserve's public face had been a cover for more sensitive conservation work, just like the dance studio. One of the most moving moments came when an elderly woman named Margaret stood to speak. She had been Jessica's grandmother's closest confidant, the one who had helped establish the underground medical facility. She revealed that Jessica's grandmother had been a trained veterinarian who had given up her official practice when she realized she could do more good working outside the system. The dance studio had been her way of maintaining a normal life while secretly dedicating herself to conservation. Margaret presented Emma with a box containing her great-grandmother's veterinary diplomas and licenses, documents that had been hidden for decades to protect the network. The box also contained something else, a detailed plan for expanding the network internationally. Jessica's grandmother had envisioned a global system of secret sanctuaries, connected by shared resources and information but operating independently to prevent any single discovery from destroying the entire network. She had made contacts in dozens of countries, many of whom were still waiting for someone to activate the international network. Emma realized that what they had uncovered in their small town was just one node in a much larger system, a worldwide underground railroad for endangered species that had been waiting dormant for someone to revive it. The responsibility was overwhelming, but the potential was extraordinary. With modern technology, they could coordinate efforts across continents, sharing information about poaching threats, habitat destruction, and government policies that threatened wildlife. They could move animals between countries when necessary, maintaining genetic diversity in populations separated by human borders. The network could serve as an early warning system for conservation threats and a rapid response team for wildlife emergencies. But it would all have to be done in secret, maintaining the delicate balance between effectiveness and invisibility that had allowed the original network to function for so long. As the gathering concluded, plans were made for the network's revival. Each member would return to their region and begin identifying potential new recruits, people who could be trusted with the secret and who had skills or resources to contribute. Emma would coordinate research efforts, using the preserved samples and detailed records to guide conservation strategies. Sarah would maintain the dance studio as a cover operation and community outreach center, teaching children the values that would make them future conservationists. Michael would oversee the renovation and expansion of secret facilities, creating a modern infrastructure for wildlife protection. The work would be dangerous and difficult, requiring sacrifices and secrets that would separate them from normal society. But as they stood together, watching Hope's descendants play in the preserve's evening light, they knew it was worth it. Every species saved, every habitat protected. Every creature given a second chance at life validated the risks they were taking. They were not just conservationists, they were guardians of a sacred trust, protectors of the vulnerable, and keepers of secrets that could mean the difference between extinction and survival for countless species. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the preserve in snow that transformed the landscape into a pristine wilderness. Faith's cubs, now several months old, experienced their first snowfall with the same wonder that Hope had shown years ago in the dance studio's hidden room. Emma watched them play, their golden fur stark against the white snow, and thought about the journey that had brought them to this moment. From a baby's innocent tapping on a mirror to an international network of wildlife protectors, the path had been unexpected, but somehow inevitable, as if every choice had been leading them toward this destiny. The dance studio continued its dual existence, teaching children grace and movement while secretly serving as a hub for conservation activities. The mirror that had hidden Hope had been replaced with a two-way mirror that allowed them to monitor the hidden room, now converted into a recovery space for small animals. Children taking classes had no idea that behind their reflection, injured birds learned to fly again, orphaned mammals were nursed back to health, and the legacy of Jessica's grandmother lived on in every creature saved. Sometimes Emma would stand in the studio, watching a class through the mirror, and marvel at how perfectly the two worlds coexisted. Research from the underground facility yielded breakthrough after breakthrough. The tissue samples provided genetic information that revolutionized understanding of several species' evolutionary history. Emma published papers that carefully omitted the source of her data, attributing insights to historical samples from private collections. The scientific community was astounded by her findings, but she maintained the secret, knowing that revealing the truth would compromise not just the facility but the entire network. The knowledge gained from her great-grandmother's work was advancing conservation science by decades, providing tools to save a species that might otherwise have been lost. The international network slowly came online, with contacts in Africa, Asia, and South America, confirming their continued commitment to the cause. Each region had its own methods and challenges, but the shared philosophy united them. They began coordinating responses to international wildlife trafficking, using their secret network to rescue animals from smugglers and return them to safety. The network's existence remained unknown to law enforcement and conservation organizations, but its impact was felt in the mysterious failures of trafficking operations and the unexplained recovery of species thought to be declining. Hope's legacy extended beyond her descendants and the network they had inspired. Her story, carefully sanitized and shared through Emma's research, had changed public perception of bear intelligence and emotional capacity. Wildlife protection laws were strengthened based on evidence of complex social bonds and cognitive abilities that Emma had documented in Hope's line. Conservation programs worldwide adopted protocols developed from studying Hope's descendants, improving success rates for rehabilitation and reintroduction programs. The bear, who had spent months hidden behind a mirror, had become, unknowingly, one of the most influential animals in modern conservation history. As spring returned to the preserve, bringing new life and renewed hope, the network prepared for its most ambitious project yet. Using information from Jessica's grandmother's maps and modern satellite imagery, they had identified a corridor of land that, if protected, would connect isolated wildlife populations across 3 states. The land was currently owned by various private parties and corporations, but the network had developed a plan to acquire it piece by piece, using shell companies and anonymous donations to hide their true purpose. It would take years, maybe decades, but when complete, it would create a protected pathway for wildlife movement that would ensure genetic diversity and species survival for generations to come. The project would require resources beyond what the network currently possessed, but help came from an unexpected source. Several tech billionaires, approached carefully through intermediaries, had agreed to fund the project in exchange for absolute anonymity. They had been moved by Hope's story and the evidence of the network's decades of successful conservation work. Their contributions would be laundered through legitimate conservation organizations, appearing as standard donations while actually funding the secret acquisition of critical habitat. The irony of using the tools of global capitalism to subvert the system that threatened wildlife was not lost on anyone involved. Emma stood in the underground facility, surrounded by the records of decades of secret conservation work, and felt the weight of the legacy she had inherited. Her great-grandmother had started something that had grown beyond anything one person could have imagined. The network now included thousands of people across the globe, all working in secret to protect the vulnerable and preserve the wild. They were teachers and doctors, construction workers and scientists, students and retirees, united by a shared commitment to something greater than themselves. They were the invisible guardians of the natural world, working in shadows to ensure that light would continue to exist for future generations. The dance studio's spring recital that year had a special theme, the hidden world. Students performed pieces that celebrated the secret lives of animals, the mysteries of nature, and the magic that exists just beyond our perception. Parents watched, enchanted by the graceful movements and beautiful costumes, never knowing that the performance was actually a tribute to the real hidden world that existed right beneath their feet. Emma and Sarah watched from the back, seeing both the public performance and the secret truth it represented. As the final dance concluded, a piece featuring a young girl discovering a magical bear in a forest, the audience erupted in applause, celebrating a story they thought was fantasy, but which the sisters knew was more real than anyone could imagine. That night, after the recital, Emma visited Hope's grave at the preserve. It was marked with a simple stone that read only, "Hope she taught us to see." Emma placed a bouquet of wildflowers on the grave and sat in quiet contemplation. She thought about the journey from that day when she was just 18 months old, her tiny hands tapping on a mirror, to now, when she led an international network of conservationists. She thought about her great-grandmother, whose vision and courage had made it all possible. And she thought about Hope, the bear who had bridged two worlds and shown them that the boundaries between human and animal, legal and right, possible and impossible, were far more fluid than anyone had believed. As she sat there, Faith approached with her cubs, now nearly full-grown and ready to start their own lives. They settled near Hope's grave, as if paying their own respects to the matriarch who had made their existence possible. Emma watched them, 4 generations of a saved species, and understood that this was what success looked like. Not headlines or recognition, not awards or accolades, but quiet moments when the saved went on living, breeding, and thriving, oblivious to how close they had come to extinction. This was the true reward for all the secrets, all the sacrifices, all the hidden work that the network did. The moon rose over the preserve, casting silver light through the trees and illuminating the bears as they moved back into the forest. Emma stood to leave, but Faith stopped and looked back at her, holding her gaze for a long moment. In that look, Emma saw Hope, saw her great-grandmother, saw the connection that bound all living things together. Faith huffed softly, a sound Emma had come to recognize as acknowledgement, and then disappeared into the shadows with her cubs. Emma smiled, knowing that the conversation between species that had begun with a baby's tapping on a mirror would continue through generations yet to come. The drive back to the dance studio was quiet, the roads empty in the late evening. Emma thought about the work that lay ahead, the challenges and dangers, the secrets that would have to be kept, and the lies that would have to be told. But she also thought about the lives that would be saved, the species that would be preserved, and the world that would be a little wilder and more wonderful because of their efforts. The network would continue to grow and evolve, adapting to new threats and opportunities, but its core mission would remain the same: to protect those who could not protect themselves, to preserve the wild in an increasingly domesticated world, and to maintain the secret sanctuaries where miracles could happen. As she pulled into the studio's parking lot, Emma noticed a light on in the hidden room. Sarah was there, tending to an injured owl that had been brought in earlier that day. Emma joined her, and together they worked in comfortable silence, two sisters continuing a legacy that had been passed down through generations. The owl, its wing carefully splinted, watched them with large, intelligent eyes, another soul saved by the network their great-grandmother had built. Tomorrow, it would be moved to the underground facility for extended recovery, but tonight it rested in the same room where Hope had once waited for rescue. The story that had begun with a baby discovering a bear cub trapped in a dance studio mirror room had evolved into something far greater than anyone could have imagined. It had become a movement, a philosophy, a way of life for thousands of people around the world who believed that every life mattered, that extinction was not inevitable, and that sometimes the most important work happened in secret. The network would continue long after Emma and Sarah were gone, passed on to new generations who would adapt it to face challenges not yet imagined. But the heart of it would remain the same: the understanding that we are all connected, that compassion transcends species, and that sometimes the smallest actions, like a baby's hands tapping on glass, can change the world. As dawn broke over the preserve, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold, the descendants of Hope emerged from their dens to greet the new day. They moved through their territory with confidence and grace, living proof that miracles were possible, that extinction could be reversed, and that love could triumph over loss. In the dance studio, the injured owl stirred, testing its splinted wing, preparing for its eventual return to the wild. And somewhere in the network of secret sanctuaries around the world, other creatures were waking to another day of life they wouldn't have had without the invisible guardians who protected them. The legacy of Hope lived on, not just in her descendants, but in every animal saved, every habitat protected, and every child who learned to see the world through eyes of wonder and compassion. The mirror that had once hidden her had become a symbol of the hidden world that existed alongside our own, a world where the impossible became possible, where the extinct returned to life, and where the smallest acts of kindness could ripple outward to touch lives across continents and through generations. The dance between human and nature continued, choreographed by those who understood that sometimes the most beautiful performances were the ones that happened in secret, witnessed only by those who knew where to look and how to see.